This is BBC One in the Midlands. Now the news at 10 o'clock with Michael Burke and Sue Beardsmore.
Labour's mystery donor is revealed. He's the publisher Lord Hamlin. He said he'd given the party £2 million to fight the next election. Death on the cliff top, the Welsh landslide that buried a car park. And George Carmen, Britain's most famous barrister, has died.
Here in the Midlands tonight, the police step up their hunt for arsonists who burnt down a shop, leaving a man fighting for his life. And the latest signing for Wolves, could this be the club's next manager?
Good evening. The publisher Lord Hamlin has come forward to say that he is the anonymous donor who's given the Labour Party £2 million. He released a statement after several days of damaging speculation, saying he'd given the money to help the party fight the next election. Lord Hamlin, who's ill and has been out of the country, said the gift was one of several large donations he's recently made to political and other causes. Our political editor Andrew Marr reports.
Who's paying for this party? British political funding has been going the American way for years. Glitzy high-priced dinners, huge private donations, and inevitably questions about who is calling the shots. Paul Hamlin, here on the left, a long-term arts and education benefactor, as well as Labour's new £2 million donor, had wanted to keep this quiet for the most human of reasons. He's seriously ill and didn't want a fuss. But a row, including worries from Labour MPs, persuaded him to break cover. He said, "Under the existing legislation, I am under no obligation to disclose the sum I have donated, but I am happy to do so. For years, the Conservatives had a virtual monopoly on large donations from individuals. I'm glad that has changed." But what about the timing? In just a few weeks, all substantial donors will have to go public.
What we've made clear is that under the new rules that the Labour Party and the Labour government is bringing in, all amounts and donations will be recorded after the February the 14th under the new legislation.
This was meant to put a stop to controversies like that over Bernie Ecclestone, the Formula One boss, who eventually had his £1 million cheque sent back after a row about whether it could have influenced policy on tobacco advertising in motor racing. So why does Labour ask for cash from the rich and famous? One clue is the changed shape of the party's finances. At the 1992 election, the unions funded 2/3 of Labour's campaign spending. Just 5 years later, that was down to 40%. Private donations, small and large, have more than filled the gap. The Tories, too, have been fiercely attacked, most recently over their treasurer Michael Ashcroft, now, like Lord Hamlin, raised to the peerage. But they were also critical.
The issue was about the extent to which the Labour Party relies on large donors, and in some instances, the extent to which the Labour Party has an unfortunate track record of giving decisions over policy or appointments and so on, which has appeared to conflict with those donations.
But campaign money has to come from somewhere.
It would be better if we didn't have to have big donations and the taxpayer put a little more money in so that we could be entirely free of political influence altogether.
So at Labour's Millbank headquarters, the new year has opened with yet another row about how we pay for our politics. Labour's General Secretary, Margaret McDonough, has just written to say that she sees a persuasive case for the state funding of parties. And that's really the question. If we're not happy to see rich men paying large cheques for our politics, we may all end up, as taxpayers, having to pay for our delicacy. Andrew Marr, BBC News.
A woman has been killed and a man seriously injured in a huge landslide in North Wales. Their car was engulfed by mud, along with 6 others, and swept into the sea. 2 helicopters, a lifeboat and 3 Coast Guard teams took part in the rescue effort at Nevin on the Llŷn Peninsula. From there, Kevin Bouquet.
It happened without warning. An avalanche of mud, stones and sand poured down the 80-foot cliff face onto a car park, jamming several vehicles against railings. As people ran for safety, there was a second landslide. 2 cars were pushed onto the beach 25 feet below. Inside one of those vehicles was a middle-aged couple.
The first landslide, from what I understand, caused the vehicle to be out of line and they couldn't open the doors. And when the second one came along, that caused the vehicle to go over the side.
Emergency teams worked frantically to get to the couple, but the woman was dead. Her husband was airlifted to hospital in Bangor, suffering from severe injuries. According to one report, seconds before the landslide, the couple had been able to pass their pet dog to safety out of the car window. Meanwhile, the driver of this camper van had experienced the narrowest of escapes.
The earth slides down, we jump back, and the earth throw the cars away. 5 minutes later, a second slide came.
Were you injured?
A little bit.
The emergency services looked for other possible casualties, but they couldn't even begin to clear the wreckage. The cliff face, saturated after months of rain, was too unstable. All activity has now ended for the night. Tomorrow, the emergency services will decide how best to undertake the potentially dangerous task of clearing away the wrecked vehicles which still lie beneath the cliff. Kevin Bouquet, BBC News, at Nevin in North Wales.
The Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat met President Clinton in Washington tonight for talks on the American peace plans for the Middle East. Palestinian negotiators have expressed severe doubts about the proposals. The Israeli leader, Ehud Barak, said there was no chance of a deal before President Clinton leaves office.
On all sides, the hope of a peace agreement on the lines proposed by the United States is evaporating. Yasser Arafat flew to Washington not so much to negotiate as to say no as politely as possible. President Clinton might still cling to his hopes, but the Palestinians think his proposals are simply too favorable to Israel. 6,000 miles away from Washington, on the edge of the Gaza Strip, the tension was palpable as Israeli tanks faced this Palestinian border post. Israel's Prime Minister isn't talking peace now, he's talking of the possibility of war.
We don't hope for it, we don't wish it, we'll do our best that it won't happen, but we have to prepare ourselves, and if it will happen, we'll have to win.
An Israeli roadblock bars the way into and out of the West Bank town of Ramallah, part of the government's response to the upsurge of violence. The Palestinians too are facing the possibility that the situation will degenerate into open conflict. In the poverty-stricken streets of the Al-Amari refugee camp in the centre of town, Yasser Arafat remains popular, and even the 10-year-olds play at being gunmen. Mr. Arafat's leading supporters here in Ramallah make it clear they don't expect or want him to do a deal in Washington.
They will not find any Palestinian who is ready to sign an agreement, because they want to keep the settlements, they want to keep their occupation in Jerusalem, they will take 90% of Jerusalem, and third, they want to cancel the right of return for the refugees. So what kind of peace we are talking about?
Inside the local Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Barghouti has come to pay his condolences on the death of a leading member of Yasser Arafat's Fatah party, shot dead by the Israelis 2 days ago. All the different tendencies within the party are here, from Mr. Barghouti, who's a hardliner, to much more diplomatic figures like Faisal Husseini at the other end of the room. But they all agree this deal is impossible.
We are doing everything to reach to a real peace, to reach to a real agreement, but we are not going to accept anything for any price.
Yasser Arafat has to bear the atmosphere in the streets in mind while he's in Washington. He knows he can't do a deal with the Americans and the Israelis, which people here would feel was unacceptable. John Simpson, BBC News, Ramallah.
Well, the BBC's Tom Carver is in Washington. Tom, it all sounds very gloomy. What are the Americans saying about how this meeting is going?
I have to say there's not a very optimistic atmosphere here. The Palestinian leader left a few moments ago, and his aide said that he would be coming back tonight, but he refused to talk to the press when he left. They have issued a huge list of clarifications that they want to see addressed, but the White House official I spoke to not long ago said that as far as the White House was concerned, it was really a matter of whether or not Yasser Arafat was prepared to sign up and agree to discuss on the basis of the framework that President Clinton laid out, or whether he wouldn't. He said, Is he going to say yes or no? That's what we want to know.
Is this the last chance, effectively, for these peace proposals? Once President Clinton goes from the White House there, is that it?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult to see a way forward because these are really President Clinton's personal proposals. He's invested a huge amount of time. He's developed a great deal of trust with the two players. He's had a lot of face-to-face meetings, and it's not going to be possible for George Bush simply to step into his shoes. And furthermore, it's not going to be top of George Bush's list of priorities when he becomes president. So unless there's a formal negotiating timetable laid out, I would say this round of talks will end with the inauguration of the new president.
Tom Carver, thanks. Here, George Carmen, one of the most famous libel lawyers of recent times, has died at the age of 71. He'd been suffering from prostate cancer. He was renowned for his skill at cross-examination and won many of the best-known court battles of recent times. He made his name defending the Liberal leader Jeremy Thorpe, and his last big victory came a year ago in the Neil Hamilton libel case. Our legal affairs correspondent Jane Peel looks back on his life.
Not just a lawyer, a household name. George Carmen's skillful turn of phrase and piercing cross-examination won cases and made headlines. He first came to prominence when he defended the Liberal Party leader Jeremy Thorpe, who was cleared of conspiracy to murder. In a BBC Newsnight interview last month, he recalled how he'd made a direct appeal to the jury.
I said words to the effect that in his time Jeremy Thorpe had obtained thousands of votes from the people of this country, and now came the 12 most precious votes of all, and went round the jury pointing, your vote and yours and yours and yours and so on.
Later he specialised in libel, acting for and against the famous. The soap actress Gillian Tailforth was one of his celebrity scalps. Politicians such as Jonathan Aitken fell at his hands. And a victim of the Carmen one-liner was David Mellor. The barrister said he'd behaved like an ostrich and put his head in the sand, thereby exposing his thinking parts. One man who saw killer Carmen in action says everyone wanted him.
And it became a sort of threat. You would say, I'm suing, and not only am I suing, but I've got George Carmen. And it was like saying you had a bigger weapon than the other side. And people were genuinely unhappy about the thought of facing George, carving them up in the witness box for a couple of days.
His last great performance was just over a year ago, representing Mohammed Al-Fayed in his victory over Neil Hamilton. In court, he famously described the former MP as on the make and on the take. The barrister up against him then remembers a man of great style.
He was never pompous or intimidating. He was often said to be a lucky advocate, but that's not to decry him in any way, because great advocates like him succeed in making their own luck.
A virtuoso performer before juries, George Carmen claimed his success was simply down to communication.
You see, the secret I've felt, and I've always felt as an advocate, is to find a memorable but simple phrase that will stay in a jury's mind, that they won't forget easily or at all.
He'd recently begun a campaign for more funding to fight prostate cancer, but the legal legend seemed to know his time was short when asked if he could beat the illness.
Oh, I wish I knew. But when I was brought up as a Catholic boy, you were supposed to pray to St. Jude for hopeless causes, so I started doing that.
George Carmen, who died today. The rail regulator Tom